The Omega Recursion. The air in the Southside District was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and wet asphalt, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder that greeted Detective Elias Brown as he ducked under the yellow caution tape. Chapter 1. The Hollow Vault. The scene was the Gilded Ledger, a high-end boutique bank that catered to clients who preferred discretion over convenience. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a surgical extraction. Detective Brown adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the marble lobby. He didn't jump into the fray of shouting patrolmen and frantic bank clerks. Instead, he stood perfectly still, practicing a habit he called letting the room speak. The initial observations: the front doors were intact, no forced entry. The security guard, a veteran named Miller, sat on a velvet bench, head in his hands. Brown noted the small purple bruise behind Miller's left ear. Entry point, likely the service entrance or an inside job. The clock. The silent alarm was triggered at 3:14 a.m. The first cruiser arrived at 3:19 a.m. The suspects were gone. The damage: one floor-to-ceiling glass partition was shattered, but not by a bullet. It looked like thermal stress. Gathering the evidence, Brown knelt by the vault door, which hung open like a slack jaw. He pulled a laser pointer and a magnifying glass from his coat. The residue, around the locking mechanism, there was a fine, pale blue powder. Not thermite, Brown muttered to himself. He scraped a sample into a glass vial. It felt cold to the touch, likely a liquid nitrogen application used to flash freeze the tumblers before a physical strike. The shell casing. A single .45 caliber casing lay near the teller desk. Curiously, there were no bullet holes in the walls or furniture. A warning shot, he wondered, or a signal, the signature. Tucked into the handle of the empty safety deposit box, number 402, was a small origami crane folded from a $20 bill. It wasn't just a theft, it was a performance. The witness account. Brown approached Miller, the guard. "Did you see their faces, Miller? Masks, detective, high-tech stuff, digital screens instead of eye holes," Miller rasped. "They didn't speak, not a word. They used hand signals like a SWAT team, but the one in charge, he had a limp, a heavy drag of the right foot." The clue in the shadows. As the forensics team dusted for prints, knowing they'd find nothing but glove smears, Brown spotted something caught in the ventilation grate near the floor. He used a pair of tweezers to pull out a small, jagged shard of black obsidian. Obsidian wasn't native to this city. It was volcanic glass, sharp enough to cut through cellular walls. And this piece had a faint, etched marking on it. A stylized Greek letter, Omega. Brown stood up, his joints popping. The Gilded Ledger hadn't just lost money, they had lost something specific, and the robbers had left a trail that felt less like a mistake and more like an invitation. The sun had long since dipped below the skyline, leaving the city draped in a neon-soaked fog. While the rest of the precinct retreated to dive bars or the comfort of their beds, Detective Brown's day was effectively starting over Chapter 2. The midnight oil. Brown's office was a sanctuary of organized chaos. A single desk lamp cast long, dramatic shadows over the evidence bags he'd brought back from the Gilded Ledger. He didn't believe in breakthroughs that happened during office hours. He believed in the clarity that came at 3 a.m., when the world was quiet enough to hear the truth. The reconstruction. Brown pinned photos of the crime scene to his corkboard, connecting them with tactile strings. He laid out the evidence: the blue powder, the .45 casing, the origami crane, and that curious shard of obsidian. The powder analysis. A quick call to a contact in the chemistry labs confirmed his suspicion. The blue residue was a proprietary industrial coolant used in high-end aerospace manufacturing. The .45 casing. Under a microscope, Brown noticed a firing pin drag, a tiny scratch on the primer. This suggested a modified or poorly maintained firearm, which clashed with the high-tech efficiency of the rest of the heist. The hidden connection. Brown spent hours scrolling through digitized shipping manifests of the city's ports. If the obsidian wasn't local, it had to have arrived by sea or air. He cross-referenced obsidian shipments with aerospace coolant thefts from the last 6 months. For hours, the screen showed no hits. Then a match flickered. A private geological firm, Ethelgard Exports, had reported a crate of volcanic samples stolen 3 weeks ago. The same night, a nearby cooling plant had been breached. The digital shadow Brown pulled up the bank's unhackable server logs. While the thieves had wiped the main security feed, they hadn't accounted for the smart thermostat in the manager's office. Modern, smart devices often pinged a central hub every 30 seconds to report ambient temperature. Brown tracked the data. 3:12 a.m. Temperature in the lobby dropped by $15 circa in seconds. The liquid nitrogen. 3:16 a.m. A brief spike in electromagnetic interference recorded by the thermostat's internal sensors. They didn't just use tools, Brown whispered, leaning closer to the monitor. They used an EMP burst to fry the local sensors, but they missed the low-frequency ping of the thermostat. The breakthrough. He zoomed in on the interference timestamp. During those few seconds of electromagnetic noise, the bank's guest Wi-Fi, usually dormant at night, registered a single handshake from a device. The device name was a string of hexadecimal code. 4F4D454741. Brown grabbed a pen and scribbled it down. Translated from hex to ASCII, it spelled Omega, the same symbol etched into the obsidian. The detective leaned back, his coffee now cold and bitter. The limp the guard mentioned, the modified gun, and this Omega signature. It wasn't a random gang. This was a message for someone. And by finding that shard, Brown had unintentionally intercepted it. He looked at the origami crane. He carefully unfolded the $20 bill. Inside, written in microscopic ink along the treasury seal, was a set of geographic coordinates. The coordinates written inside the $20 bill didn't lead to a high-rise or a hidden bunker. They led to a place Elias Brown knew better than his own reflection. The Blackwood Pier, a crumbling stretch of wood and rusted iron where he'd solved his first homicide 15 years ago. Chapter 3. The mirror's edge. The fog rolled off the harbor in thick, gray ribbons. Brown arrived at the pier at 4:45 a.m., his hand resting instinctively on the holster beneath his coat. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic slapping of the tide against the pilings. The searchie followed the coordinates precisely, his GPS pinging as he reached the very end of the pier. There was nothing there but an old, salt-crusted bait locker. Brown began a meticulous sweep of the area. He expected a dead drop, a flash drive, a ransom note, perhaps a body. Instead, he found a trail of clues that felt hauntingly familiar. The footprints. In the soft mud near the pier's base, he found a set of boot prints. He knelt to measure them. They were a size 11 his size. The tread pattern matched the specialized orthotics he wore for his fallen arches. The cigarette, a single, unlit clove cigarette, sat on the railing. It was a rare brand, imported from a specific shop in the East End. Brown reached into his own pocket. He had the exact same pack, the shell casing. Another .45 caliber casing lay glinting in the moonlight. It wasn't just the same caliber as the one from the bank. It had the same distinct, firing pin drag. Scratch the impossible connection. Frustrated and feeling a cold sweat prickle his neck, Brown returned to his vehicle. He opened his trunk to grab a high-powered floodlight, but his eyes snagged on his gear bag. The zipper was caught on something. A small, jagged piece of black obsidian. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pulled his service weapon, a modified .45, and ejected the magazine. He cleared the chamber and inspected the firing pin. With a sinking realization, he saw the minute burr on the metal tip. His gun was the one that had marked the shells, the files that shouldn't exist. Brown drove back to the precinct, bypassing the main entrance and using the service stairs. He needed to check the evidence locker from the bank heist one more time. He pulled the digital log for the Gilded Ledger case. His breath hitched. The log showed that the evidence, the blue powder and the origami crane, had been checked out for independent lab analysis at 2:15 a.m. The signature on the checkout form was his own, but at 2:15 a.m. he had been at home, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Or had he the breaking point? He turned to his computer and pulled up his own personnel file, bypassing the security encryption he had helped design. Deep within the metadata, of his recent psychiatric evaluation, a standard procedure after a traumatic case last month. He found a hidden subfolder labeled Project Omega. Inside was a video file. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, taken from a high-angle security camera. It showed a man in a dark trench coat moving with a slight, pained limp, skillfully bypassing the laser grid of a high-security vault. The man paused to fold a $20 bill into a crane. As he turned toward the camera, his face was obscured by a digital screen mask, but as he reached up to adjust it, the sleeve pulled back. On the man's wrist was a distinctive watch, a silver heirloom with a cracked face. Brown looked down at his own left wrist. The cracked silver watch ticked steadily in the silence of the office. The evidence didn't just point to him, it suggested he was the architect of the very crime he was assigned to solve. The realization hit Brown like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He sat in the flickering glow of his monitor, the silver watch on his wrist feeling heavier than a pair of iron shackles. Every instinct honed over 20 years of police work screamed at him to report the anomaly, to call Captain Miller and step down. But a deeper, colder instinct held his hand back. If he was the one who did this, why couldn't he remember? And if he didn't do this, the frame job was so perfect that telling the truth would be synonymous with a confession. Chapter 4. The silent rogue. Brown didn't call for backup. He didn't log the new findings. Instead, he deleted the Project Omega subfolder from his local cache and scrubbed the browser history. For the first time in his career, Detective Elias Brown was suppressing evidence. The paranoia sets in. He walked through the precinct bullpen, his eyes darting to every colleague. Was Sergeant Higgins looking at his shoes longer than usual? Did the tech specialist, Sarah, linger on his login credentials? He realized that if he was being framed, the architect had to be someone with access to his psych files, his schedule, and his home. He began to mentally map out his missing hours, the gaps in his memory that he had previously dismissed as exhaustion. The home sweep. Brown slipped out of the precinct and drove home, not to sleep, but to dissect his own life. He treated his apartment like a fresh crime scene. The entryway, he dusted his own doorknob. Only his prints appeared, but he noticed a microscopic smear of blue industrial residue on the carpet fibers near the coat rack. The medicine cabinet. He found his bottle of prescription sleep aids. He counted the pills. There were 4 fewer than there should have been. Someone was drugging me, he thought, or I'm self-medicating and forgetting. The hidden camera. He used a signal detector, a tool he usually kept for counter-surveillance. It let out a sharp, high-pitched whine near the smoke detector. Tucked inside was a pinhole lens wired directly into the building's power grid. He was being watched. The countermove. Brown didn't remove the camera. If he did, he'd alert the architect that he was onto them. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, directly in the camera's line of sight, and began to clean his service weapon with methodical, calm strokes. If they want me to be the villain, he whispered to the empty room, I'll play the part until I find the director. He pulled out a burner phone he kept for confidential informants. He texted a single number, a man known only as the Eraser, who specialized in digital forensics that the police department couldn't legally touch. The message, I need a deep dive on Project Omega, off the books. Price is no object. The discovery in the lining. As he prepared to head back out, Brown grabbed his backup trench coat. As he slid his arm into the sleeve, he felt a crinkle. He reached into the inner lining and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was a pharmaceutical receipt for a drug called Hypnosil, an experimental sedative used in clinical trials for memory suppression. The name on the prescription wasn't Elias Brown. It was Dr. Aris Thorne, the very psychiatrist who had cleared him for duty last month. Brown stood in the dark of his apartment, the blue light of the city's neon signs bleeding through the blinds. He wasn't just being framed for a robbery, he was being used as a lab rat. The weight of the receipt in his pocket felt like a lead weight. If Dr. Thorne was pulling the strings, Brown was no longer a detective. He was a walking liability. He needed to know the why behind the robbery. Why would a master architect of a frame job have him steal money only to leave the evidence scattered in his own life. He needed to see the loot. Chapter 5. The weight of gold. Brown didn't go to the precinct. He didn't go to Dr. Thorne's office. Instead, he drove to a suburban storage facility on the edge of the city, a unit he had rented years ago under a false name, Arthur P. Miller, to keep old case files he couldn't bear to shred. The hidden hall, the corrugated metal door screeched as he slid it up. The air inside was stale and smelled of mothballs. In the center of the unit sat a nondescript black duffel bag that hadn't been there a week ago. He unzipped it. His breath hitched. It wasn't just a few stacks of bills. The bag was stuffed to the seams with high-denomination notes, unmarked, non-sequential, and totaling what looked like millions. Tucked into the side pocket was a secondary prize, a series of encrypted hard drives bearing the gold leaf seal of the Gilded Ledger. The problem: he was a decorated detective with a clean record and a bank account that currently held $1,200. The reality: he was standing over enough cash to buy a new identity, a new face, and a quiet life on a beach where Omega was just a letter in a dead language. The temptation of the exit. Brown sat on an old milk crate, the millions of dollars staring back at him. He thought about the eraser, the burner phone in his pocket, and how easy it would be to vanish. He mentally mapped the route: drive to the regional airport, take a private charter to Mexico using the Arthur Miller passport tucked in his floorboards, disappear into the interior. For 10 minutes, the silence of the storage unit was broken only by the ticking of his cracked watch. The limp in his leg, the one the guard mentioned, started to ache. Was it a real injury or a psychosomatic manifestation of the guilt he was being forced to carry? The turning point: he reached into the duffel bag, his fingers brushing against the cold leather. But as he moved the money, he noticed something at the very bottom of the bag. It was a GPS tracker, its small red light blinking with a steady, taunting rhythm. He wasn't meant to keep this money. He was meant to be caught with it. If he fled, he was proving his guilt to the world. If he stayed, he was a prisoner of a game he didn't understand. A new resolution. Brown realized that fleeing wouldn't just be an admission of guilt. It would be a surrender to Thorne's design. He took a single stack of hundreds, enough to fund his investigation, and zipped the bag back up. He moved the bag to a different, unlisted locker in the same facility, one he broke into manually to ensure no digital paper trail. He walked out into the pre-dawn light, his face set in a grim mask of determination. He wasn't going to run. He was going to use the villain persona they had built for him to burn the whole theater down. He pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Thorne's private exchange. "Doctor," Brown said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel, "I'm having those headaches again. I think I need an emergency session." Right now. The heavy iron shutters of the storage facility groaned as Brown locked them. He didn't go straight to Dr. Thorne's office. Instead, he checked into a dingy, cash-only motel on the outskirts of the industrial district. His mind was a fractured mirror, and he needed a way to glue the pieces back together without Thorne's professional help. Chapter 6. The melatonin mirage. Brown sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, the neon vacancy sign outside pulsing like a heartbeat. He knew he couldn't trust his waking mind, and he certainly couldn't trust Thorne's prescriptions. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a bottle of over-the-counter melatonin he'd picked up at a 24-hour pharmacy. "Natural sleep," he muttered. "No hypnosil, just me and my subconscious." He swallowed a double dose, laid back, and stared at the water-stained ceiling until the world blurred into a heavy velvet black. The dream landscape. The dream didn't start like a dream. It started like a tactical briefing. He was standing in a void, his body draped in the same high-tech tactical gear the guard had described. He felt the weight of the digital mask on his face. Beside him stood three figures, their features obscured by a shifting, static-like haze. The command, a voice, cold and synthesized, echoed not in the room, but inside his skull. Omega 1, proceed to the primary node. The action, he watched himself, as if from a third-person perspective, moving through the Gilded Ledger. He saw his own hands, steady and rhythmic, applying the blue nitrogen coolant. He felt the phantom kick of the 45 as he fired the warning shot into the ceiling. The revelation in the dream, he wasn't a victim, he was a masterclass in efficiency. But then, the dream glitched. The bank vault didn't hold money. When he swung the door open in his mind, it held a massive, glowing obsidian monolith pulsing with the same Greek Omega symbol. The three figures behind him bowed. One of them stepped forward and handed him a mirror. Brown looked into the mirror. He didn't see Elias Brown. He saw Dr. Aris Thorne, smiling with a mouth full of jagged glass. "You aren't the detective anymore, Elias," Thorne's voice whispered in the dream. "You're the evidence." The violent awakening, Brown bolted upright, his shirt soaked in cold sweat. The sun was beginning to bleed through the cheap curtains. He checked his watch, 8:12 a.m. The dream had been wild, surreal, and impossible, but it left him with one crystalline detail that hadn't been in the police reports or his own notes: the third floor. In the dream, before leaving the bank, he had gone to the third-floor executive washroom and hidden something behind a loose marble tile, something he hadn't told his team about. It was a moment of rebellion by his subconscious, a failsafe hidden even from the architect of his trance. The realization he realized that the melatonin had acted as a bridge. By avoiding Thorne's sedative, his brain had attempted to process the erased memories as a nightmare. The robbery wasn't just a crime, it was a ritual or a test, and Thorne was using some form of post-hypnotic suggestion to turn Brown into a sleeper agent. He grabbed his coat. He didn't need a session with the doctor. He needed to get back into the bank, not as a detective, but as the thief he now knew he had been. The adrenaline from the dream was fading, replaced by a gnawing, intellectual hunger. Brown sat in the driver's seat of his sedan, the engine idling in the motel parking lot. He looked at the bottle of melatonin on the passenger seat. The dream had given him more than any forensic kit ever could. It was a doorway into the Omega version of himself, the version that knew how to bypass sensors and where the bodies were buried. But the memory was already beginning to fray at the edges, like a photograph left in the sun. Chapter 7. The alchemist's risk. Brown knew the risks. Re-entering a self-induced trance using a high dose of sleep aids was dangerous. He was already mentally unstable, according to his official files. If he slipped too deep, he might not come back as Elias Brown at all. He might wake up as the limping man for good, the preparation he didn't just pop the pills. He turned his car into a makeshift sensory deprivation chamber. He pulled the sunshades over the windows. He put on noise-canceling headphones, playing a steady loop of white noise to drown out the city. He set a timer on his watch for 60 minutes. If he didn't wake up by then, a loud, piercing alarm would shatter the trance. He took a triple dose this time. He leaned his head back, closed his eyes, and beckoned the Omega to return, diving deeper. The transition was faster this time. The darkness didn't just swallow him, it folded around him. He was back in the void, but he pushed past the bank robbery. He wanted to see the before the clinic. He saw himself sitting in Dr. Thorne's office, but the room was different. The walls were lined with monitors displaying his own brainwaves in real time. The trigger. Thorne wasn't talking about trauma recovery. He was reciting a string of numbers. 8, 14, 21, Omega, 3, 14, the command. Thorne held up the obsidian shard. The way the light hit the volcanic glass created a specific frequency of strobe. Brown felt his dream self go limp. "You are the perfect witness, Elias," Thorne's voice echoed. "Because no one suspects the man who is honestly hunting himself." The hidden objective in this deeper layer of the dream, Brown saw a new detail. He wasn't just stealing money or hard drives. He saw himself in the vault, holding a small, pressurized silver canister. It wasn't marked with currency or bank logos. It had a biohazard symbol and a timestamp from 1994. He watched his dream self hand the canister to a woman standing in the shadows of the vault's loading dock. She had a tattoo on her neck, a small black crescent moon, the glitch in the matrix. Suddenly, the dream. Thorne turned and looked directly at observer Brown. "You're not supposed to be here, Elias," the dream doctor said, his face distorting like a corrupted video file. "Taking the supplements to find me? That's clever, but you're digging a hole you can't climb out of." the white noise in his headphones began to scream. The dream world started to collapse, the marble floors of the bank turning into liquid obsidian. The sudden snap, the alarm on his watch blared. Brown's eyes flew open. He gasped for air, his heart racing at a dangerous $140 beats per minute. He felt a sharp pain in his arm. He looked down and saw that in his sleep, he had gripped his own forearm so hard his nails had drawn blood in the shape of a Greek letter. He wasn't just exploring his memories anymore. He was being hunted inside his own head. But he had what he needed, the woman with the crescent moon tattoo. She was the handoff. He reached for his laptop. He didn't need the police database for this. He needed the underworld registries, the kind of people who handled biohazard materials from the 90s. The motel room felt smaller than before, the walls closing in with the weight of two lives, the detective and the thief. Brown knew he couldn't stay in this limbo. To find the truth, he had to go back under one last time to see where the Omega persona intended to end up. He didn't just take the melatonin this time. He chased it with the last of his cold coffee and lay back, surrendering to the pull of the void. Chapter 8. The Andaman Ghost. This dream wasn't a tactical briefing. It didn't smell of ozone or cold marble. It smelled of salt spray, expensive teak wood, and the sweet, floral scent of jasmine. The vision. Brown found himself standing on the deck of a sleek, white yacht cutting through the turquoise waters of the Andaman Sea. The limestone casts of Phuket, Thailand, rose out of the water like jagged emeralds in the distance. The man in the mirror, he walked past a glass sliding door and saw his reflection. He looked younger, relaxed. The limp was gone. He was wearing a linen shirt, and in his hand was a glass of chilled Mekong whiskey. The companion, the woman with the crescent moon tattoo, was there, leaning against the railing. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was real, smiling, holding a folder containing the codes to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The realization, this wasn't a memory, it was the exit strategy. The Dreamthorn appeared beside him, leaning on the railing as if they were old friends. "This is the happily ever after I built for you, Elias. You do the job, you take the fall back home, and the limping man dies in a shootout with police. But you wake up here, a ghost with a fortune." The price of the ticket. As the yacht sailed closer to the coast, Brown looked back at the wake of the boat. The water wasn't blue anymore. It was turning into ink-black obsidian. "But there's a catch, isn't there?" Dream Brown asked. Thorn chuckled, a sound like dry leaves. "The catch is that Elias Brown has to die. For the detective to disappear, he has to be framed so perfectly that there is no turning back. You have to become the monster the city thinks you are." Suddenly, the sky in the dream fractured. The serene Thai coastline began to burn, replaced by the flickering red and blue lights of a police raid. He saw himself, the detective version, sitting in a prison cell, while the ghost version enjoyed the sun. The violent awakening. Brown woke up not to an alarm, but to the sound of a heavy engine idling in the motel parking lot. He stayed perfectly still, his eyes darting to the gap in the curtains. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked 3 spaces down from his sedan. 2 men in tactical gear were checking the plates. The decision to flee the dream hadn't just been a hallucination, it was a warning from his subconscious. Thorn wasn't just framing him to get away with a robbery, he was clearing the board. Once the Detective Brown persona was arrested or killed, the Omega assets, the money, the biohazard canister, would be moved, and the real Elias would be disposed of or reprogrammed permanently. He realized the Thailand dream was the bait. Thorn wanted him to run, to take the money and flee, because a fleeing cop is a guilty cop. But if he stayed, he was a sitting duck. The plan was clear. He couldn't go back to the precinct. He couldn't go to Thorn. He had to disappear, not to Thailand, but into the cracks of the city. He grabbed his bag, the stolen stack of hundreds, and his modified 45. He slipped out the back window of the motel just as the front door was kicked in. The transition from fugitive to traveler was a blur of adrenaline and forged documents. Using the eraser's connections, Brown secured a flight out of the country before his face hit the national wire. He expected to be running away from the case, but the case, had a way of pulling him back into its gravity. As his plane touched down in the sweltering heat of Bangkok, his burner phone vibrated. It was a restricted number. Chapter 9, The Bangkok Connection, Detective Brown, a voice crackled through the line. It wasn't Thorne. It was Inspector Vachara of the Royal Thai Police. I was told you were the lead on the Gilded Ledger heist. We have a situation at a private terminal in Phuket. It's a mirror image of your crime scene. Brown's blood ran cold. He hadn't even checked into a hotel, and the Omega followed him across the globe. The scene at the pier, Brown met Vachara at a secluded marina. The humidity was a physical weight, sticking his shirt to his back. The scene was a carbon copy of the Southside heist. The residue, pale blue industrial coolant, frosted the hinges of a high-security transport crate. The signature, a $20 bill folded into an origami crane, sat atop a pile of discarded zip ties. The theft, this wasn't a bank, it was a secure medical transport. The manifest listed the cargo as experimental pharmaceutical prototypes. They took everything, Vachara said, wiping sweat from his brow, but they left a witness. A woman, she says she knows you. The woman with the moon. Brown followed the inspector to a nearby medical tent. Sitting on a crate, nursing a bruised wrist, was the woman from his dreams. The crescent moon tattoo on her neck was unmistakable in the harsh Thai sun. She looked at Brown, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, weary recognition. "You're late, Elias," she whispered. "The doctor said you'd be here yesterday." The missing piece, she handed Brown a small, jagged object she had hidden in her palm. It was another shard of black obsidian, but this one was larger, shaped like a key. "Thorne isn't just stealing money," she said, her voice dropping so the Thai police couldn't hear. "The Gilded Ledger was the bankroll. This theft was the catalyst. He's looking for the Omega strain, the original sedative that created the missing hours in your head. He ran out of the supply he used on you. He needed the prototype to finish the reprogramming of the city's elite." The yacht in the distance, Brown looked out toward the horizon. There, sitting in the turquoise water of the Andaman Sea, was the white yacht from his melatonin-induced dream. It wasn't a fantasy of retirement. It was Thorne's mobile laboratory. The robbery here in Thailand wasn't a separate incident. It was the final ingredient Thorne needed to make his Project Omega permanent and scalable. Brown realized his dreams weren't just memories, they were a synchronized psychological link. He was seeing the plan because he was still a part of the network. The realization. Brown looked at his cracked watch. It was ticking in perfect synchronization with a buoy clanging in the harbor. He wasn't just here to solve a crime. He was here because Thorne needed him here to complete the circuit. "If I go on that boat," Brown muttered to himself, "I might never come back as the man I was." "You already aren't that man," the woman replied, standing up. "Now are you going to arrest me, or are we going to finish this?" The humidity of the Thai coast was suffocating, but Brown knew he couldn't face Thorne while his mind was still divided. He needed to be Omega 1 to get past the yacht's security, but he needed to be Detective Brown to stop the plan. He retreated to a secluded beach shack, the woman with the moon tattoo standing guard outside. He didn't just take the melatonin this time, he used the obsidian key she had given him. He held the sharp edge against his palm, letting the cold, volcanic glass act as a tactile anchor. Chapter 10. The waking nightmare. He closed his eyes and plummeted. There was no transition this time, only a violent snap into a new reality. The dreaming heist. He was back in the gear. The digital mask hummed against his cheekbones. He was inside a high-security facility, not a bank, but a temple-like structure carved into the limestone cliffs of an island. The objective, row after row of glass canisters filled with a swirling, violet gas. The action. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He wasn't limping. He was a predator. He disabled 3 guards with non-lethal precision, his hands moving before his brain could even process the command. The mirror. He saw his reflection in the glass of the canisters. The digital mask flickered, showing his own face, but his eyes were glowing with a dull, synthetic light. Inside the dream, he heard Thorne's voice, amplified through the facility's intercom. "Good, Elias, now secure the strain and bring it to the deck. The transformation is almost complete." the jarring bridge. As Dream Brown reached for the final canister, the real-world Brown forced a massive surge of adrenaline. He bit down on his tongue, the sharp tang of blood acting as a psychological kick. He didn't just wake up in the shack. He jarred awake with a violent, full-body convulsion, only to realize with a jolt of pure terror that the dream hadn't ended. He wasn't in the beach shack. He was standing in the middle of a sterile, white corridor. His hands were gloved in tactical polymer. He was holding a heavy, pressurized case he had traveled while under. Whether it was a fugue state or Thorne's hypnotic Project Omega taking full control during his trance, Brown had physically moved from the shack to the very yacht he had seen in the distance. The panic set in the digital mask on his face felt like it was fusing to his skin. He ripped it off, gasping for the recycled, chilled air of the ship. The reality, he was on the third deck of the yacht. The alarm. A rhythmic red pulse began to flash against the white walls. A voice, the real Thorne, not the dream version, boomed over the speakers. Patient 1 is experiencing a conscious state rejection. Security to the lab corridor. Brown looked at his hands. They were shaking. The cold, calculating Omega was retreating, leaving behind a confused, terrified detective in the heart of the enemy's fortress. The flight he didn't think. He didn't strategize. He ran. He sprinted down the narrow hallway, the heavy case banging against his ribs. He turned a corner and nearly collided with two armed men in gray suits. Without thinking, his Omega muscle memory kicked in. He swept the first man's legs and shoved the second into a bulkhead. But the detective in him screamed in horror at the ease of the violence. He burst through a set of heavy doors and out onto the deck. The sun was blinding. The yacht was moving fast, leaving a white scar on the turquoise sea. "Elias," a voice shouted. He looked up. Dr. Thorne was standing on the bridge balcony, looking down with the disappointed gaze of a father watching a child fail a test. "You can't run from your own mind, detective. You're holding the very thing that makes you you." Brown looked at the case in his hand. It wasn't money. It wasn't a virus. It was the complete archive of his own memories, digitized and extracted. In a blind panic, Brown scrambled toward the railing. The water was a long way down, and the propellers were churning the sea into a lethal froth. But behind him, the heavy thud of boots was getting closer. The wind whipped against Brown's face, carrying the scent of salt and the ozone of the yacht's humming electronics. He stood on the edge of the railing, the pressurized case clutched to his chest. His heart wasn't just racing. It was skipping beats, struggling to synchronize with the two different timelines currently warring for space in his brain. Chapter 11, The Bleeding Edge. As he looked back at Dr. Thorne, the world began to stutter. For a fraction of a second, the bright Thai sun vanished, replaced by the flickering fluorescent lights of the Southside District precinct. He felt the cold weight of a coffee mug in his hand, then snap, he was back on the yacht, the tropical heat stinging his eyes. The realization the dreams weren't just memories or predictions, they were blueprints. Every time Brown went under, he wasn't just seeing the past, he was being programmed to execute the future. The dream of the yacht heist hadn't been a dream at all. It was a hypnotic overlay he had performed in real time. The evidence, he looked down at his boots. They were stained with the same blue industrial residue from the bank. The injury, the cut on his hand from the obsidian key in the dream, was bleeding in the exact same pattern in the waking world. The law of conservation. He realized with a jolt of horror that he hadn't traveled to the yacht. He had been on the yacht the entire time. The shack and the woman with the moon tattoo were the last remnants of a crumbling mental firewall. The architecture of a lie. Dr. Thorne stepped closer, his voice calm, cutting through the sound of the wind. "The human mind is a narrative engine, Elias," Thorne said. "It hates a vacuum. When I erased your nights, your brain filled them with dreams to make sense of the trauma. But the bridge is falling down. You're beginning to see the world as it truly is, a series of commands." Brown looked at the case. If the dreams were becoming reality, then the Thailand exit he saw earlier wasn't a reward, it was a disposal site. The final stutter. Suddenly, a massive wave of vertigo hit him. He saw the Gilded Ledger vault door standing open in the middle of the ocean. He saw the guard, Miller, pointing a finger at him, but Miller's face was shifting into the face of a Thai deckhand. The boundaries of time and space were dissolving. He was the detective, the thief, the victim, and the weapon all at once. "If the dream is reality," Brown whispered, his voice cracking, "then I can change the ending." The leap of faith, he remembered the dream of the yacht from Chapter 8, the one where the water turned into ink-black obsidian. He realized that in that dream, he hadn't drowned. He had walked on the surface. In a moment of pure, desperate madness, Brown bet everything on the hope that he could still influence the programming. He didn't jump to swim. He jumped to break the loop. He stepped off the railing. As he fell, the world glitched one last time. The sound of the yacht's engines faded, replaced by the silent, rhythmic ticking of his cracked silver watch. He hit the water, but it didn't feel like water. It felt like falling into a cloud of cold, blue powder. The midnight awakening Brown's eyes snapped open. He was back in his apartment in the Southside District. It was dark. The smart thermostat was clicking. He was sitting at his kitchen table, his service weapon disassembled in front of him. But he wasn't alone. Tucked under the barrel of his .45 was a wet, salt-stained envelope and a small, jagged piece of black obsidian. On the envelope, in his own handwriting, were the words, "The yacht is real. Find the CAYMANCODES." He hadn't escaped the nightmare. He had just brought it home with him. The apartment felt like a tomb. Brown stared at the salt-stained envelope, his skin still prickling with the ghost sensation of Thai humidity. The line between here and there was no longer a line, it was a smudge. Exhausted, his mind buckled under the weight of the paradox, and he collapsed into a heavy, unbidden sleep right there at the kitchen table. Chapter 12. The golden hallucination. He wasn't in a bank. He wasn't on a yacht. He was back 20 years in the past, standing on the parched asphalt of the police academy training grounds. The memory, the sun was high and honest. A younger Elias Brown, face free of lines and eyes full of certainty, stood in a line of recruits. He could smell the gun oil and the scorched grass. He felt the weight of the badge they were about to pin on him, a symbol of a world where right and wrong were as clear as black and white. The instructor, a faceless drill sergeant, barked orders about integrity. The vow, to protect and serve, the younger Elias shouted, his voice cracking with genuine conviction. It was the purest moment of his life. But then, the sky began to bleed. The glitch in the past, the blue sky of the academy grounds didn't turn dark, it turned luminous. A strange, ethereal glow, a shimmering amber light, began to seep out of the cracks in the asphalt. The other recruits didn't notice. They continued to march, their boots hitting the ground in a rhythmic thud that sounded increasingly like the ticking of a giant clock. Brown turned away from the formation and saw himself, not the young recruit and not the tired detective. He saw a third version of himself standing 20 paces away. This version was draped in that same strange, golden glow, standing perfectly still in a vacuum of silence. The observer, the glowing Elias, wasn't wearing a uniform or tactical gear. He was wearing the hospital gown from his psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Thorne. He looked at the detective with eyes that weren't human. They were swirling galaxies of data and light. "You're looking for the thief," the glowing figure said, his voice resonating through Brown's teeth, "but you're standing in the middle of the crime scene." Brown looked down. The asphalt beneath his feet wasn't stone anymore. It was a giant, translucent Petri dish. The academy was just a slide under a microscope. He looked up, and instead of the sun, he saw the massive, distorted eye of Dr. Thorne peering down at him from the sky, observing the recruit through a lens. The shattered mirror, the glowing version of himself, stepped forward and pressed a hand against Brown's chest. The heat was unbearable. "The academy didn't make you a cop, Elias," the figure whispered. "It made you a container. You were chosen because your sense of justice was so strong it could hold the weight of the crimes we needed you to commit." Suddenly, the glow intensified, blinding him. The sound of the marching recruits turned into the screeching of tires and the blare of a precinct siren. The violent return. Brown bolted upright in his kitchen chair, knocking his disassembled .45 to the floor. The apartment was filled with a dull, gray dawn, but as he looked at his hands, He saw the fading remnants of that strange amber glow under his fingernails. It wasn't a dream. It was a side effect. He realized with a jolt of clarity what the Omega strain actually was. It wasn't a sedative. It was a bioluminescent neural mapping agent. Thorne hadn't just been drugging him. He had been lighting him up from the inside so he could track his thoughts like a GPS. He looked at the salt-stained envelope from Thailand. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew what was inside. He stood up, his limp gone, replaced by a terrifying robotic precision. "I'm not the detective," he said to the empty room, his voice sounding exactly like the glowing figure from the dream. "And I'm not the thief. I'm the evidence." The gray dawn of the apartment was too loud, too heavy with the scent of old coffee and betrayal. Brown knew that the only way to dismantle the Omega programming was to go back to the source. The moment his mind was still his own, he didn't take pills this time. He sat on the floor, back against the cold oven, and used a technique he had learned in the early days of the academy, sensory deprivation through focused breathing. He slowed his heart rate until the edges of the room blurred. Then, with a violent mental shove, he forced himself into the dark chapter 13. The foundation of Sandha jarring wasn't a fall, it was a collision. He felt the impact of his boots hitting the sun-baked asphalt before his eyes even opened. The loop. He was back. The Police Academy, July. The heat was a physical wall, $35 Circe dollar and climbing. He was standing in the middle of a drill, his pulse thrumming in his ears, the sensation. The coarse fabric of the recruit uniform scratched his neck. The taste of salt and grit was in his mouth. The command, "Recruit Brown, why is your weapon unholstered?" Brown looked down. In his hand wasn't the training Glock, but his modified .45 from the future. It felt impossibly heavy, a piece of dark metal from a nightmare brought into the light of his youth. The fracture in time. He looked around the formation. The other recruits were blurs of movement, their faces shifting like static. He realized he wasn't just remembering this, he had hijacked the memory. He broke rank. "Recruit, return to the line," the instructor roared. But as Brown turned to face him, the instructor's face melted. The drill sergeant's hat remained, but the face beneath it was Dr. Thorne's. "You trying to hide in your childhood, Elias?" Thorne's voice echoed across the parade grounds. "There is no before. I was there when you took the psychological entrance exam. I was the one who marked your file with the Greek letter. I've been the architect of your life since you were 22. The Discovery. Brown ignored the phantom Thorne and ran toward the Academy's administrative building, a place that, in his real memory, had been a simple brick structure. Here in the dream reality, it was a tower of black obsidian. He burst through the doors. Inside, the halls weren't filled with lockers and trophies. They were lined with the same glass canisters from the yacht. He saw a younger version of himself sitting in a chair, a series of wires snaking from his scalp into a primitive computer. On the screen, a file was being written in real-time. Subject name, Elias Brown. Designation, Omega 1, the vessel, protocol, selective memory suppression / moral anchor implementation. The anchor. The Academy was the lie. Thorne had used the training to instill a hyperfixation on justice so that Brown would be the perfect detective, a man so obsessed with the truth that he would never suspect he was the one hiding it. Brown walked up to his younger self. The boy looked up, his eyes wide with the same strange amber glow he had seen in the apartment. "They didn't teach us how to catch criminals," the younger Elias whispered. "They taught us how to be a cage." The sudden kick outside, the sound of the marching recruits grew deafening, turning into a rhythmic, mechanical grinding. The obsidian walls began to crack. Brown realized that by returning to this memory, he had alerted the Project Omega security system in his own brain. He was being purged from his own past. He grabbed the younger version of himself by the shoulders. "Where is the master key? Where did he hide the bypass?" The boy pointed to the silver watch on Brown's wrist. "It's not a watch, Elias. It's the synchronization point. Break the glass and you break the link." The transition back to consciousness was a violent, gasping affair. Brown slumped against the cold kitchen oven, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon through the desert heat of his own past. The amber glow beneath his skin was pulsing in time with the throbbing in his skull. Chapter 14. The vigil. He looked down at the silver watch. The glass was already cracked, a web of fractures he had always attributed to a scuffle during a foot chase 3 years ago. Now he realized that crack was a leak in his reality. The terrifying truth, the realization settled over him like a shroud. The loop was closed. If Thorne had been there at the academy, then every case Brown had solved, every friend he had made, and every night he had spent alone was part of a scripted narrative. He wasn't just a man with missing hours, he was a man living a missing life. Every step forward was just a choreographed move on a stage he couldn't see. The fear, to sleep was to be programmed, to dream was to be deployed. The stakes. If he closed his eyes, he might wake up in another bank, on another yacht, or standing over another body, all while believing he was just dreaming. The war against sleep. Brown stood up, his movements stiff and jerky. He gathered every source of caffeine in the apartment, brewing a pot of coffee so dark it looked like oil. He lined up the bottles of the erasers, high-potency stimulants, next to the kitchen sink. He began to pace. He couldn't trust his bed. He couldn't trust his couch. He even feared the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, worried the sound was a hypnotic trigger designed to lull him back into the Omega state. "Stay awake, Elias," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Stay in the gray, don't go back to the gold." The hallucinations of the wakeful. By the 36th hour of wakefulness, the edges of the apartment began to fray. The shadows. He saw the crescent moon woman standing in his peripheral vision, but when he turned, it was just his trench coat hanging on the door. The sound. He heard the sound of marching boots from the academy echoing in the plumbing of the building. The physicality. His hand, the one that had held the 45 in the dream, felt permanently cold, as if the liquid nitrogen from the vault had frozen his very bones. He realized he was in a catch-22. If he slept, Thorne won. If he stayed awake, his mind would eventually fracture into a psychosis that would make him just as easy to manipulate. The message in the mirror. At the 48th hour, Brown stood before the bathroom mirror, splashing freezing water on his face. He looked at his reflection, bloodshot eyes, sunken cheeks, a man haunted by himself. As he watched, his reflection didn't blink when he did. The reflection leaned forward, its lips moving in silence. Brown pressed his ear to the cold glass of the mirror. "You're reliving it already," the reflection whispered. "This isn't the first time you've tried to stay awake, Elias. Look at the tally marks." Brown pulled back the shower curtain. There, etched into the tile behind the plastic liner, were hundreds of tiny scratches, tallies grouped in fives. He had been in this apartment, in this state of terror, countless times before. He wasn't fighting to stay awake. He was trapped in a revolving door of a timeline, and every awakening was just the start of another cycle. The 72nd hour of wakefulness brought a clarity that was sharper than any drug. Brown didn't need a map or a GPS. As the clock edged toward 3:14 a.m., the exact moment of the initial heist, his body began to move with a magnetic pull. He found himself standing outside the Gilded Ledger, the air smelling of wet asphalt and roasting coffee, just like the first time. Chapter 15. The collision of self. The street was eerily silent, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps. Brown gripped his 45, his knuckles white. He knew what was happening inside. He knew the sequence. He knew the limping man was about to trigger the nitrogen. The mirror event. Brown bypassed the front doors, which he now knew were unlocked for him, and stepped into the marble lobby. There, bathed in that haunting, amber-gold bioluminescence, was the thief. It was a vision of perfection and horror. The Omega version of Elias Brown moved like a ghost, his hands applying the blue coolant to the vault with the grace of a surgeon. The thief was surrounded by a shimmering field of light that seemed to warp the very air around him. "Stop!" Brown screamed, leveling his gun at the glowing figure. "I know what you are. I know the loop." The paradox. The thief didn't turn. He didn't flinch. Instead, the Omega version spoke, his voice echoing from every corner of the room at once. "You can't stop the evidence, Elias. You are the shadow trying to shoot the sun." In a fit of desperation, Brown lunged forward. He didn't fire the gun. He threw his entire weight at the glowing figure, intending to tackle himself out of existence. As his skin touched the amber light, The world didn't explode, it inverted. The marble floors turned into liquid. The gold light became a blinding white roar. The sound of the silent alarm became a deafening, rhythmic clanging of a metal cup against iron bars. The final awakening. Brown's eyes snapped open. There was no neon light, no smell of coffee. The air was cold, dry, and smelled of industrial bleach and old stone. He tried to spring up, but his body betrayed him. His joints screamed with a deep, arthritic fire. His hands, once steady enough to disassemble a firearm in the dark, were thin, spotted with age, and trembling uncontrollably. He wasn't in a bank. He was in a 6-by-8-foot concrete cell. The grey reality, an old man, a version of himself that looked 80 years old, sat on a thin cot. He looked down at his wrist. The silver watch was gone, replaced by a plastic ID band, inmate number 1, Elias Brown. A shadow fell over the cell door. Dr. Thorne stood there, looking exactly as he had 30 years ago, not a single grey hair on his head. He held a clipboard and a small vial of violet liquid. "How was the trip this time, Elias?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with clinical boredom. "You were the detective for a long time in this cycle, almost 3 weeks of subjective reality." Where am I?" Brown rasped, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "You're in the Omega Institute," Thorne replied, signaling for the guards. "You've been here since the academy. You were the first successful upload. Every robbery, every Thailand escape, every clue was just us stress testing your neural plasticity. We needed to see if a man with a broken conscience could still hunt himself." The loop restarts. Thorne stepped into the cell and pressed a needle against the old man's neck. "Don't worry," Thorne whispered as the violet liquid entered Brown's veins. "In a few seconds, you'll be 40 again. You'll be standing under the yellow caution tape in the Southside District. You'll smell roasted coffee and wet asphalt. And you'll have a very important case to solve." As the world began to fade into that familiar, amber glow, the old man's eyes clouded over. His last conscious thought was a fleeting memory of a crescent moon tattoo before the detective took his first step back into the dream. The violet liquid was supposed to bring the reset, the sweet amnesia of the Southside District, but something went wrong. Perhaps it was the jarring of his mind against his younger self, or perhaps the Omega strain had finally reached its saturation point. Instead of waking up in front of the yellow caution tape, Elias Brown found himself suspended in a terrifying, grey limbo. Chapter 16. The static between stations. He was back in the cell, but the walls were no longer concrete. They were flickering, translucent planes of code and geometry. He lay on the cot, his ancient body feeling like a suit of lead. He closed his eyes, begging for the dream of the detective to take him, but sleep wouldn't come. He was stuck. The glitch in the void. Brown stared at the ceiling. A section of the stone bubbled and popped, revealing a dark, infinite vacuum behind it. He realized he was no longer experiencing the simulation. He was witnessing the rendering. The senses, there was no smell of bleach now. There was only a low-frequency hum, the sound of a cooling fan the size of a planet. The physics. He dropped his metal cup. It didn't clatter. It hit the floor with a digital thud and clipped halfway through the ground before resetting to his hand. "If I can't sleep," Brown whispered to the flickering air, "I can't restart. And if I can't restart, I'm just data." The simulation theory. He began to piece together the fragments of his shattered timelines. The watch. It wasn't a synchronization point for a hypnotic trance. It was a latency monitor. The cracks appeared when the simulation struggled to keep up with his subconscious. The obsidian. These weren't keys or clues. They were corrupted files, bits of reality that the system couldn't properly categorize, appearing as jagged, black anomalies. The people. Miller, the woman with the moon tattoo, even the younger version of himself. They weren't people. They were subroutines, designed to nudge him back toward the center of the narrative whenever he strayed too far toward the truth. The architect's error. A flicker of light appeared at the bars of his cell. It wasn't Thorne. It was a projection of the glowing Elias from the academy, but it was stuttering, its limbs stretching and snapping like a broken animation. "You've reached the end of the disk, Elias," the projection said, its voice a mixture of Thorne's tone and a dial-up modem. The detective file is corrupted. The thief file is overwritten. There is nothing left to load. Brown felt a cold, existential dread. If life was just a simulation, then Elias Brown never existed. He wasn't an old man in a cell, and he wasn't a hero. He was a logic loop that had finally found its own tail and bitten down. The final question. Brown sat up, his joints creaking with the sound of rusted metal. He looked at the infinite vacuum peering through the holes in his cell. If I'm just a program, Brown asked the void, who is the one asking the question? The room began to dissolve into pure, blinding white. The hum grew into a roar. For a split second, he felt a sensation he hadn't felt in any of his lives. Real wind. Not the salt spray of Thailand or the breeze of the academy, but a sharp, cold draft from a high-tech laboratory. He heard a voice, a real, organic voice, far above him. Subject 1 is flatlining. The simulation has reached a terminal paradox. Pull him out. As Elias Brown's consciousness hangs in the white void between the collapsing code of the Gilded Ledger and the cold reality of the laboratory, the fundamental nature of his existence becomes clear. He is no longer living a life. He is experiencing a computational event. Chapter 17. The architecture of the unreal. To understand Elias' predicament, one must understand the simulation theory, the hypothesis that all of reality, including his memories of the police academy and the vault in Thailand, is actually an artificial simulation, likely a computer program run by a more advanced civilization or a shadowy corporation like the Omega Institute. The three pillars of Elias' reality concept: the simulation explanation, the Omega application. Ancestors / history. High-powered computers can simulate the past with 100% accuracy. Thorne didn't teach Elias. He programmed a detective archetype into a blank mind. Mathematical underpinnings. The universe is governed by laws that look like lines of code. Physics. The strange amber glow was the rendering engine failing to hide the data stream. The observer effect. Reality only renders when someone is looking at it. The Gilded Ledger only existed when the detective was assigned to find it. Why the simulation broke. According to the theory, a simulation can only remain stable as long as the agent, Elias, accepts the reality provided to him. Brown's persistent dreams were actually system errors. Latency. The limp was a lag in the movement data buffer overflow. The melatonin mirages occurred because Elias' mind was processing too much data for the program to hide during the sleep cycle, the terminal paradox. By meeting himself in Chapter 15, Elias created a logical contradiction. In programming, if $A equals $B and $B equals text not a dollar, the system crashes. The Omega hypothesis. In this informational layer, it is revealed that Project Omega was not a bank robbery plot. It was a stress test for sentient AI. The goal was to see if a synthetic consciousness, Elias, could develop human guilt. Thorne isn't a doctor, he is a lead programmer. The old man in the cell is the physical server, the hardware that is finally wearing out after decades of running the same detective software over and over. The final logic: if the simulation theory holds, then every tragedy Elias faced was merely a variable adjusted by Thorne to see how he would react. The crescent moon woman was a user interface, and the obsidian shards were hardware fragments, physical manifestations of the machine he is trapped inside. The terrifying conclusion of Chapter 17 is this: if Elias wakes up, he won't find a home or a family, he will find a motherboard. The white void of Chapter 17 was no longer a silent observation. It was a pressure building behind Elias' eyes, a frequency that hummed in his teeth. He stood in the center of the flickering geometry, his aged, frail body trembling, not with fear, but with the sudden, icy clarity of a man who has seen the wiring behind the stars. Chapter 18. The hard reset. Elias looked at the gaping holes in the reality around him, the vacuum where the floor should be, the static where the sky used to hang. He drew a breath, feeling the artificiality of the oxygen, the way it tasted like ozone and dry data. "I know," he whispered, then louder, his voice cracking against the shimmering planes of the cell. "I know it's a simulation." The declaration. He stood tall, defying the arthritic fire in his joints. None of it was real. The academy, the robbery, the detective, it's just code. Thorn is a program, I am a program. This is all a lie. The moment the words left his lips, the universe reacted. The sound. The low-frequency hum escalated into a piercing, digital scream, the sound of 1,000 modems crying out at once. The visuals, the translucent walls of the cell didn't just flicker. They began to scroll. Columns of green and gold light cascaded down the air, revealing the raw data of his surroundings. The physics, gravity inverted. For a second, Elias was weightless, suspended in a sea of hexadecimal characters. The flash, just as he prepared to scream again, there was a blinding, ultraviolet flash. It wasn't a transition. It wasn't a jump like his melatonin dreams. It was a total sensory blackout. For a microsecond, Elias Brown didn't exist. There was no thought, no eye, no darkness, only the absolute absence of a signal. System recovery initiated, flushing cache, rebuilding Sector 7, restoring archetype. The detective, the reboot, the flash faded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a sharp, stinging sensation in his eyes. Elias blinked. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee and wet asphalt. He was standing on a rain-slicked street in the Southside District. The blue and red lights of police cruisers danced across the puddles. He felt the familiar weight of his spectacles on the bridge of his nose and the heavy, comforting bulk of his .45 in its holster. "Detective Brown," a voice called out. Elias turned. It was a young patrolman, one he vaguely remembered from 1,000 previous lives. "You okay, sir? You've been staring at that caution tape for a full minute. You look like you've seen a ghost." The residual ghost. Elias adjusted his spectacles. His mind felt clean, pristine. The memory of the old man, the yacht, and the simulation theory was gone, replaced by a singular, driving focus. But as he reached into his pocket for his notebook, his fingers brushed against something cold and sharp. He pulled it out. It was a tiny, jagged shard of black obsidian. He looked at it, a frown creasing his brow. For a split second, a word flickered in the back of his mind, Omega, but it vanished before he could grasp it. "I'm fine, son," Brown said, his voice steady and calm, "just letting the room speak. Let's head inside. I hear the Gilded Ledger had a bit of a rough night." He stepped under the yellow tape, his boots clicking perfectly on the pavement, ready to solve the crime for the very first time. Again, the cycle had closed. The reboot was seamless, the world rendered in high-definition clarity. Detective Elias Brown stood in the lobby of the Gilded Ledger, the metallic tang of the flash-frozen vault door stinging his nostrils. Everything was exactly as it should be. Chapter 19, The Infinite Loop. Brown knelt by the vault, his movements fluid and practiced. He pulled his magnifying glass from his coat pocket. He felt a strange sense of déjà vu, but he dismissed it as the intuition of a seasoned investigator. "The perfect crime again, surgical," Brown muttered, looking at the blue residue on the hinges. "They used a liquid nitrogen application, high-end stuff." The guard, Miller, sat on the same velvet bench, the same bruise forming behind his ear. The floor, the same shattered glass partition, lay like diamonds across the marble. The clue. Brown reached into the handle of safety deposit box number 402. His fingers found the origami crane folded from a $20 bill. He unfolded the bill with steady hands. He expected to see the coordinates to the pier. He expected the microscopic ink. But as he held the bill up to the light, the simulation, or his mind, offered a final, cruel deviation. The glitch in the paper. The bill didn't have coordinates. It had a single sentence written in his own handwriting. "Don't look in the mirror." Brown froze. The patrolmen continued to bustle around him, their movements rhythmic, almost mechanical. He looked at the obsidian shard he had found in his pocket earlier. It was pulsing with a faint, amber light that matched the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The mirror's truth. Slowly, as if pulled by a magnetic force he could no longer resist, Brown turned toward the mirrored wall behind the teller desks. He didn't see the middle-aged detective with the spectacles. He didn't see the old man in the cell. He saw a skeleton of light, a complex lattice of golden data points shaped like a man. Where his heart should have been, there was a spinning obsidian core etched with the Omega symbol. Behind his reflection, the bank lobby wasn't made of marble and gold. It was a wireframe grid stretching into an infinite, dark sky. The final surrender, Brown reached out and touched the glass. The mirror didn't feel like glass, it felt like a liquid screen. "Detective?" the patrolman asked, his voice sounding like a skipping record. "Detective." Detective." The world began to blur. The scent of coffee vanished, replaced by the humming of a cooling fan. Brown realized that the reboot hadn't been a fresh start, it was a patch. Thorne had tried to fix the error, but Elias was too far gone. He was no longer a character in the story, he was the virus in the machine. "I remember," Brown whispered. He didn't run, he didn't panic. He closed his eyes and leaned his forehead against the cool, digital surface of the mirror. He accepted the loop. He accepted the simulation. As he let go, the bank lobby dissolved for the last time. The red and blue lights of the cruisers merged into a single, steady amber glow. The story of Detective Elias Brown reached its final line of code. System shutdown, logging off, Omega protocol complete, the end.